150 participants. And I think we did such a good job that it probably translated into the attendance tonight. So hopefully we'll be able to do just as well. Before we get into the meat of the program tonight, I just wanted to share this for anybody that is particularly hearing some of this information for the first time. Please, please, please take this flyer home. We want you to be able to save these dates. We want you to take this flyer too and share it with your HOA or your church organization. We really want to push the boundaries of exposure. The other thing I wanted to highlight too is that until June 15th, the survey is live. The survey is live on the APS website. We really, again, want to encourage as many folks to participate in that survey because that is going to be key. The survey will be key to help determine what the plan will be. Now, I hate to bust anybody's bubble. If you're expecting to hear what the plan is or if there is a plan, I hate to tell you this, there's not exactly one yet. That is the purpose of this. These community meetings will help inform and educate the plan, along with components like the Community Task Force, along with the components of HPM and APS leadership. So keep that in mind. Nothing is set in stone. I cannot repeat that enough. I do not want to alarm anybody. And this plan really is taking into account the facilities of APS overall, and how that translates, number one, into education, how that translates into programming, and how that can translate into workforce housing. So it's a multifaceted approach that addresses all of that in addition to early childhood education and really pushing the boundaries on all those areas while keeping the main focus students and their education. You'll hear from a couple folks tonight, and we will introduce them as we go. Also, we will have a portion for public comment towards the end of this presentation. You will see this card here. We ask you, please fill out this card because, again, all of this, as you can see, is going to be on the record. We're going to have these videos along with the video from the noon meeting posted within the next 24 to 48 hours on the APS YouTube page. So if you want to go back and listen to it, or if you want to see if there was any difference from the noon and the 6, you'll be able to see that in real time. And we also want to make sure that we accurately reflect the folks that are sharing their thoughts with us. With that being said, we are going to give you an idea of what the program and what you'll see tonight. This lays out the whole itinerary for tonight, and then before we go into the presentation, we'd like to share with you a video that can give you, again, a broad overview of this program overall.
Atlanta Public Schools is a large school district steeped in more than a century of history, culture, and achievement. For 153 years, APS has been serving students within the city of Atlanta through a caring culture of access, trust, and collaboration to build a future where every student will graduate ready for college, career, and life beyond school walls. What started as only 6 schools in 1872 has grown into more than 75 learning facilities for nearly 50,000 students in 2025. And produce graduates as illustrious and remarkable as the city it's in. Some of the world's most recognizable names have walked the halls as students of Atlanta Public Schools, from civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Charlene Hunter Galt, to business moguls like Chick-fil-A founder Truett Cathy and Coca-Cola president Harrison Jones. Elected officials like U.S. Senator Johnny Isakson and Atlanta's first black mayor, Maynard Holbrook Jackson, to entertainers like Gladys Knight and Andre 3000. The city of Atlanta has always made history with bold decisions, courageous leaders, and ideas that were ahead of its time. But what some don't realize is that Atlanta Public Schools has the same legacy. In 1969, Dr. Benjamin Mays, a towering figure in civil rights and education, was elected president of the Atlanta Board of Education. It was a time of fear, skepticism, and racial tension. schools were just beginning to desegregate. People said, this isn't the right time. But Dr. Mays and the board did what they were elected to do. They put students first and made a bold, future-focused decision. They went all the way to California to bring in Dr. Alonzo Krim, the first Black superintendent in APS history. Today, more than 50 years later, APS is once again stepping into history with a long-range plan to reimagine our schools and campuses. With the help of the community and specialized experts at HPM, we will reshape the future of education for Atlanta Public Schools. HORE Program Management, or HPM, is a construction program management company skilled at blending data and community input to create a plan for strategic growth over the next 10 to 15 years. This is not some group of out-of-towners coming in with an agenda to shake up what we know and love about APS, but rather a curated team of experts led by a former Georgia educator that will help us position the district to better serve our students. And because they're not builders, the HPM team has no vested interest in the outcome except for what matters to you. Think expanded programs, better facilities, improved engagement, and more personalized learning environments. That could mean more access to early learning, more community resources, or even schools designed to serve multiple neighborhood needs. For example, despite Atlanta's prominence as a mecca of arts and entertainment, APS lacks a performing arts school. Let's fix that. Your children deserve better. They deserve more. So how will it work? On April 15, 2025, the Atlanta Board of Education unanimously approved the contract with HPM at its public meeting. On May 5th, we published a State of Schools report that assesses the condition of each facility in the district. You can find it on the homepage of the APS website. This gives us valuable information about which buildings need improvements and how much it would cost. On May 8th, we held the first meeting of the Community Task Force because the most important part of this process is you. We are committed to transparency and involving the community every step of the way. To make sure every voice is heard, we're doing 3 things. First, we created the Community Task Force. It's made up of about 100 parents, staff, and community members from each attendance cluster. The Board of Education selected community representatives, while staff members were chosen from Go Teams. Every school in the district is represented in this group. The task force will meet at least 4 times to share feedback with the leadership about what's going on in the district and provide critical perspective that will help guide the ultimate plan. The presentation from the first session is already available on the APS website. We'll also host at least 4 public meetings, inviting the community to speak, knowing the comments will be heard and weighed heavily when developing the final plan. If you can't make it in person, we'll offer virtual sessions when it works best for you and send out a community-wide survey so you can give us information about desired school size and programs you'd like to see. And finally, we've created a landing page on the APS website with information about every part of this process. Updates will be posted in real time. Remember, this is a customized plan based on your voice. Once we get the final feedback, the board will gather in June to go through it all. Over the rest of the summer, leaders at HPM will work with APS to develop options based on all the community feedback and data. Each new draft is presented to the task force and the community for review and modification. That process continues until a solid recommendation is formed and presented to the board in November for a first read. The goal is to have an approved plan by December 1st that will be implemented over the next 10 to 15 years. Operating too many facilities can stretch thin resources like teachers, maintenance, and food services. Operating too few facilities can have the same negative effect. A long-range facilities plan isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about building stronger communities together. This process reaches far beyond school walls. By rethinking how we use APS properties, we open doors for early learning, affordable housing, even for APS staff, and economic development. These spaces can shape the workforce, uplift neighborhoods, and serve the common good. Because when we invest in schools the right way, with data, community voices, and shared vision leading the way, we're not just shaping classrooms, we're shaping the future of Atlanta. APS has shaped leaders, artists, athletes, and change makers. And just like before, Atlanta is ready to lead again. Forward thinking isn't new for this city. It's time we do it again. Join us in bringing APS forward and reshaping the future of education.
So that video should give you a pretty broad understanding of this overall project. And let me just make sure I reiterate this. This is all a working program. This is not, nothing has been decided, nothing is set in stone. And these meetings and this process that is starting in May will help shape and determine that. With that being said, I would now like to welcome Tracy Richter. Tracy is with HPM, and he will be leading the presentation regarding APS Forward.
Thanks, George. Good evening, everybody. How are you tonight? Okay, so let's get started on, first of all, let's kind of tell you who I am. My name's Tracy Richter. I work for a group called HPM. I'm a long-range facility and capital planner. I've been doing this for about 25 years across the country. And I will tell you how, in a lot of school districts, certainly, and a lot of small school districts, a lot of big school districts, kind of everything in between. Let me first by telling you how excited I am to be working in Atlanta Public Schools. The Jewel City, I believe, the city that sets the standard for the South. And so I am very honored to be working here and with a great staff, great leadership with Dr. Johnson and his staff in here. And so it's a pleasure to be working here. But I want to take you through tonight, kind of the goals that we have for tonight. We're not going to talk a lot about facilities tonight. We need to talk about how to build a facilities plan in a comprehensive way. And it's not kind of a traditional way of doing it, we don't think. I believe that Atlanta Public Schools has done great process in the past when it comes to facilities. I think we're just going to take it another step into it. One of the first things that we think about when we think about strategic planning and long-term facilities planning is how do we align it to the district strategic plan. This is critical, that you don't separate the two ever. The district has worked really hard to develop the first steps in entering into their 2030 strategic plan. And how do we move forward with Atlanta students and shaping the future? And I think this is a key. It really identifies Atlanta students, where when you're building plans like this, you don't build them for what might be the norm out there, okay? What I've learned about this is that the uniqueness of school district is really how you develop these and the information that comes in to build these plans. Specifically, when it comes to the strategic plan, right down here, our system being effective and efficient really lends itself to the facilities plan. Talking about, how we provide the schools and the facilities that maximize the usage, maximize program offerings, to all APS students out there. And so even though I think it impacts everything up here, that is kind of the key focus when we're talking about how it links to the strategic plan. Now, the other thing we talk about in facilities planning is that I make the analogy of comprehensive planning being like a four-legged stool. And, the analogy is this, is that if you can imagine that facilities kind of are the top of the stool, is what you sit on. That we address several factors when it comes to good facilities decision-making. I think that districts sometimes enter into a plan thinking about, first of all, well, we have money coming up, so how are we going to spend it? That's maybe a funding, or they think, our buildings are in bad condition, so we have to have a facilities plan. Or we have, or our demographics are shifting, we're overcrowded, we're underutilized. That drives a plan. But the problem with that is that you have to pay attention to all of it. And so when we talk about long-range facilities planning on a four-legged stool analogy, we really talk about kind of those the benchmarks in each one to make sure that we're creating a stable plan. So when we talk about demographics and enrollment, not just paying attention to how many kids or how, what the projection looks like, but really paying attention to who those kids are and where they are, impacting, how we deliver programs and where the schools need to be. The condition actually is twofold. We talk about obviously the physical condition of the building, roofs, HVAC, all those things that kind of make a facility. And, there's really good statistics and data on that. They're pretty easy to measure, quite frankly. It's a lot of work to get the information, but when you know a roof is expired, you know a roof's expired. You know how much it costs to replace a roof. And so kind of outlining all that's really important to a plan like this. But the other side of condition is what we call suitability or adequacy. The idea that a school can programmatically handle the programs that are in the buildings. STEM labs, science labs, special education suites, all those kind of different spaces that accommodate students, are they appropriate, for the students that are in those buildings? And so we call that kind of a suitability. So that's the second leg is condition. The third one, and I believe the most important, and what we're here mostly to talk about tonight, is the educational framework, how a district operates. That is a cornerstone to any facilities plan, because it has to be. We don't build schools and they say, figure out how to use it. We actually should do the opposite. We should be saying, how do we use schools and how should we shape them for the future for that? It is an opposite way of thinking a lot of times. But this framework is really what we're talking about, what I call kind of the rules for planning. And this is where, again, every district starts to differ, is that trying to figure out what the parameters for decision making is really critical to a plan like this. And so how is that framework developed? Well, it's developed two ways. It's driven by community and vision in community, paying attention to those community needs, but it's also driven through data, what data kind of tells us also. And the trick to any good facilities plan is balancing the two. Because if you rely too much on the data, you can ignore the community need. But if you listen too much to the community need, you could ignore data. And so they have to merge together in a facilities plan. And finally, that fourth leg of the stool is funding, is the ability to maintain facilities over time and what affordable solutions are for that. So understanding that the facilities plan is really driven to be a longer term vision for how facilities will support all of those things when it comes to the long range plan. But it is not. But this phase of it is not. It is not East Bluffs planning. I say this all the time. In the state of Georgia, you have this beautiful thing called East Bluff, that the funding across the nation isn't like this. And it is truly a blessing to the school districts to have the ability to raise funds to help support infrastructure. But the opposite side of that is where districts have gone now in Georgia, is that all their planning goes to East Bluffs. Like, we're so focused on what the next need is because the funding's going to be there for it. What we want to make sure of is that the long-range facility, the comprehensive plan, informs the East Bluff. So we don't get in the way of future projects, or we don't get in the way of those decisions that we thought might be a good decision because of an immediate need, but if we look 3 or 4 years out, might get in the way of something greater. And so we have to combine the two. And so this is what this plan is really about. And so tonight is really about developing that framework, how we think about the process and the purpose of this plan, getting those input from the community, and certainly looking at all this data, and that's what we're going to pay attention to now. The process is really about discovery and then kind of validation of that data. We've spent the last several months, I will tell you, one thing this district has plenty of is data, and it's good data. And to combine that data into something more consumable, because data is everywhere, and you can see that. But one of the things that we spent a lot of time on is trying to understand the data. It's not just collecting it and putting it together, but really understanding what it means to Atlanta Public Schools. And so I think that's a big part of what we do, and how do we validate that? When we ask questions about data, we're trying to dig to the deeper meaning of that data. And so what that means. Eventually, this goes into a planning phase, where you start to make decisions based on the framework that the community helps you provide and what the data is telling you, and you start to develop those scenarios about how the pathways to solve this will be. And there will be several pathways to this, and not all pathways will be closed down immediately. Some may stay very much open through the duration of this plan because it has to have adaptability and flexibility to it. And so as we move through this, eventually getting to a more comprehensive plan that leads to this SPLOST. Community outreach is very important to us. this task force that we talk about, and I know there's a lot of questions about how it got selected and all that, but what we made sure to do is at least invite every school to be represented in this plan. And that was important. Obviously the cluster representation is very good, but that school by school knowledge is important to a process like this. The day-to-day, what's happening in those. Obviously we're going to continuously meet with principals in this process and the stakeholders there, but that community task force will act as a process oversight group. They'll review data. They'll make sure that data is good. They'll vet it with us and make sure that it's as good as it can be. They're going to help us try to communicate this as we move through the next several as kind of that voice box out there in the communities when people don't have access to the website or things like that. We want to make sure that that voice gets put out there. And then the public meetings. Now, what you're going to see in the public meetings are obviously some dates that were established, but what I want you to know is those dates aren't just like one day. Those are kind of, when we're looking at like the week of August 25th or something like that, we're looking at the week of August 25th. We want to make sure that we're trying to engage as many communities as we can. And sometimes it's going to take more than just one meeting like this. We want to try to, where we need to, we're going to take deeper dives into the clusters, into those communities where we have to make those meetings happen to make sure that we're reaching the most people. Now, again, we won't know that unless people let us know. And so we need to make sure that in these public meetings, we're trying to get as much input as we can on what is an enormous amount of data, okay? And so, and then obviously the Board of Education updates. Those are really important because those still provide the community an opportunity to see where we are in the process and keeping them informed about decisions that are going to be made. Ultimately, the Board of Education will have to make decisions on what the projects going forward are and what the framework for the plan should be. So we created what we call State of the Schools. The State of the Schools is simply a central source of data of school information. It is where the schools stand today. Okay, it's not forward thinking, it's not backward thinking, it's about here's where we are today based on the data. So you'll see certain school information in here. You'll see some demographics that look at projections. You'll look at facilities data. There's some program information in there, but all in light to make sure that we can come from a central source of data working together on it. Now, part of this is making sure that the task force has seen this data too, and they're looking at it and saying, hey, that data doesn't seem right, or what does that mean, or how are you interpreting that data? And I think that's important questions to be asked to us because I'm a big believer in that you just shouldn't accept data as it is. You should look at data to make sure that it is informing you the right way. And I shouldn't be the one to tell you what the data is telling you. I should be able to tell you this could mean this, but be careful because it can also mean this. And I think that's a really important part of this process. And you're going to see several examples of that as we go through this in this presentation. The other thing is this is a living document. Now, when I say living document, that's a true statement. And the reason for that is that we have to continuously update this document. This process is going to be done after we get new enrollment in the fall, for instance. So we're going to have to update the enrollment information. We're going to have to update that utilization by building information. Sometimes programs move. We're going to have to adapt to that too. So this document has to continuously move forward in a live kind of version and making sure it stays current with the planning needs and beyond. So let's look at some of that background data. First and foremost is, well, not foremost, but we talk about facilities age. Now, not for the reason that facilities age means that it means the disposition of a building and what should happen in that building, but how buildings were built during eras over time, over the last 100 years, they look vastly different. And those buildings deliver vastly different. And so if you can think about those old grand structures that were built in the 1920s and 30s, actually very green buildings, good natural daylighting, good airflow because they didn't have, great lighting. They didn't have no air conditioning in them. But they're very solid buildings too. A lot of size in those buildings. But as you started to move through the years and got into those 40s and 50s where we rapidly built buildings to handle those big enrollment shifts, so maybe not the best materials, not flexible, but an interesting kind of architecture theme through the 1950s and 60s that you don't necessarily want to lose. You got to the 70s, and just like me, went to that open concept. I went to the open concept high school. My high school was built in 1970. And those kind of changed over time. And then you got in those 90s, and you saw those pod concepts where you kind of grouped. So you can see that facilities age isn't just about the number on the building, but it's about what those buildings were kind of themed to do. And so how will those adapt to the future education needs in APS? And I think that's a really important key to this. Also, then we look at demographics and projected enrollment. this map shows some of that kind of projected growth or even decline in areas. But we want you to know, first and foremost, that the way we conduct projections is we look at where students live, not necessarily where they attend to start. And the reason for that is that there are so many factors about how many students can attend a building and where they can attend a building, that the baseline of information is where students live and how they should be served at home first. You know, kind of if you think back to kind of the premise of building a school district, right? The first kind of premise of a school district is that if I build a boundary, that boundary school should have enough seats for how many students live in the boundary, right? Now, that's the basic of education. The problem with that is that's not how school districts operate anymore. And so in a minute, I'm going to show you what we call a live attend analysis about how we use that information about where students attend versus where they live to help us make better decisions. But ultimately, what we do is we geocode students and we track them to where they live over time. And we have many, many years back, I think we have 15 years even back data, that we can show you kind of trends about where students lived compared to where they went to school. And the other thing nice about this is that even when boundaries get moved or something happens in a district that reshapes it, you can reshape the live-in to whatever the boundary is. So, because that never changes, it's constant. And so we can show you the impacts of what it meant to the students that live in boundaries, even historically, which is kind of a cool thing to do when you're doing this. We also look at progression ratios and how students progress from birth all the way through 12th grade. Now, one of the key elements in this is birth data. Now, we do track birth data by the cluster, by each boundary, which is fascinating to know that Georgia can track births like that because, again, not many states do that. Your state does it very well. But what that means is that we can track students we can show progression ratios about how many students are born here versus how many students show up here. Now, keep in mind, that's not a one-to-one ratio. You know, there's students that are born here that leave and go to other school districts, but there's other kids that are not born here that show up in your school district. And so what you do is you track over time and you try to figure out what that progression ratio is from birth to kindergarten or even birth to first grade, because kindergarten hasn't always been an option, you know, because there's early childhood centers that will take care of that. So you track a lot of it to kind of determine kind of that baseline of information. But there's other trends in here, like housing information. You know, how does housing impact, you know, what's going to happen in a projection? And a lot of this is what's fascinating about today's era is that what housing is doing to student enrollment is kind of the Wild West at this point. And if you look anywhere in the country, this is happening. You see these cities of large growth, but declining enrollment in their public school enrollment and even charter enrollment and private school enrollment. And so this declining birth rate is setting kind of a standard that even housing hasn't been able to adapt to. Now, also in the city of Atlanta, talking about affordable housing has become a very much discussed topic about how do we put affordable housing in the city to make sure that young families can be here and afford homes in here and bring children into the district. That's a big thing that we need to talk about. Now, and the mayor has put together an aggressive plan towards 2030, you know, for affordable housing in the city. How does this plan adapt to that when we're not sure when those will come to fruition or how they come to fruition all the time? We know where planned units are going to be. And even in some cases, we know where some of the planned units are going to be. But how do you adapt a plan to that? And so making sure that we pay attention to all that when we're doing projections is important. You know, over the past several years, that the decline of enrollment has been real. And again, a lot of this can be attributed to this lower entry point at the kindergarten level and the first grade level. It even started pre-COVID. Just so you know, that COVID really did have an impact on this. But even pre-COVID, we started to see this decline. And what that has meant over time is that the starting baseline of students who even come into the district can't fulfill what's been in the district before that. And I'll show you a chart on that in a minute. But eventually, when you're looking at forecasts like this, and this is what I say about data, and I will tell you this about data. Inherently, every projection is wrong because it's never going to be the exact number, because that's very hard. But to narrow down those kind of those things that make variances is the most important piece to this. And then as you start to break down even closer into the clusters, even more important. And so that 5-year reliability, I believe, and I've said this for 25 years in doing this, 5-year reliability of a projection is very good. I think the reliability of 5 years is very good because you have at least birth data from 5 years. After that, you start projecting birth data, and who knows, right? And so, but that's the baseline of information. But as you start to move into this plan, again, looking at those, but also continuously updating, looking at October counts and March counts, and continuously looking at this enrollment as we move forward. And again, there's variation of growth. There's some decline in the district, and there's growth in other parts of the district. And so how do you balance that and maintain facilities and try to balance that with your enrollment? Now, if I look at the charts, and again, don't let the numbers blind you necessarily. It's more about the color coding on this to show you that red would mean the larger enrollments, blue starts to mean a smaller enrollment as you move through the district, okay? Now, this is all students. This includes charters in there. But if I start to even just look at this chart, the numbers I kind of want you to look at is if you look at that, let's say 2016, 2017 kindergarten enrollment. I see a number of 4,789. That was less than 10 years ago. This year, the enrollment was 3,721. That's literally 1,000 less kids coming in the school district. Now, if I were just to project that and say, if I get 1,000 and that 1,000 progresses year by year, that means there's going to be 12,000 less kids over 12 years. Well, that's not how it works. We know that. Because progression ratios, there's some grades that go over 100% progression. That's fine. But as you go through this, and even if I start to look at the ones without charter, I can still see that 16, 17, which was a big year, just under 4,000 is now under 3,000. And so our baseline of enrollment actually starts in the negative. And you can see, as the big grades go through, that 2925 in kindergarten is going to have to somehow replace 3,900. Now, so we can talk about housing, but when I talk about like student yields in housing, like if I know that let's say a single family home can generate 0.3 elementary kids per household, and I'm trying to make up for 1,000 less, the debit and credit says that I have to have a lot of houses producing more kids than outpaces the birth data. So at 0.3, I need to get 1,000 kids back, I need 3,000 homes to be built just to make up for the delta. And so as we look neighborhood by neighborhood, this is important to look at both sides of the equation. Even though you might see housing, there's one area in the city, and I wish I would have looked it up because we just looked it up a couple weeks ago, that I saw this enormous housing growth, but the population of student enrollment had dropped and dropped and dropped. And so if I were just to look at housing, would I say that the more housing you get, the less students you get? No, I obviously wouldn't do that. And so again, just paying attention to these numbers is really important as we get deeper into the data. If we look at the projected enrollment, and let's just go to the ones without charter there, again, the projected enrollment still shows this decline of enrollment, but over the next 5 years, it slows dramatically, okay? Kind of stabilizing through the district. We got that big enrollment that's still going to stay in the district for a while, but it's going to progressively move out. And unless there's some sort of major kind of differentiator in there, again, the housing growth or the population growth. And we do know that we have this development that's happened along in the city. Along the Beltline, things like that, we see these young families coming in that aren't quite on the radar yet, but they're coming, okay? But we need to make sure we continue to track that. Also, when you start to look at then capacity and utilization, I think, again, I share this with everybody, maybe the most debated topic in school planning anymore is the capacity of a school building. And first and foremost, when you're dealing with capacity, the first thing we have to understand is that capacity is a fluid number. It is a number that is not stagnant. And there's reasons for that. Now, let me tell you first how we calculate it. We figure that, and let me tell you, there's 1,000 ways to calculate capacity. And in all the school districts I've worked in, I've probably seen 1,000 of them, right? But I think when you start to look at the capacity of a district and how they define capacity, what the state of Georgia does is they assign what they call instructional units for facilities that determine capacity, and they give a low, medium, and high range for that. Again, understanding that there's going to be fluidity in the programs that go into those buildings. We have determined that using that medium IU range is a good defensible number that we can use for the general capacity of a building. Now, but that will change. And here's how it changes. And I'll give you the easy example I can give you. 1 year, a school is a general classroom, and its capacity, let's say, is 20 students per classroom. The next year, we have to use that very same classroom for special education. And all of a sudden, the capacity went down to 10 or 12. So we just lost 8 to 10 seats in that building just due to the program. No bricks and mortar move, just one classroom. That's how capacity of a building can change that quickly. And so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that. And this becomes a school by school discussion, obviously, but when we're looking at the broad general plan to go apples to apples about capacity in buildings, we use this formula. Again, this will have a huge impact when we start to develop some of those options and scenarios out there. Overall in the district, if you look at seats, there's almost 20,000 empty seats in this district. Now, across the board, it does sound like a lot, and it's a lot. But keeping in mind, how do we efficiently use these buildings where we can't go to zero because there's way too many fluctuations in demographics that allow us to do that. But how do we get this to a number that makes sense? Because of those 19,214 seats, guess how many you heat and cool? All of them. Guess how many you light? All of them. Guess how many rooms are still there that have to be maintained over time? All of them. Now, here's the other thing about utilization, though. If I think programmatically about schools, if I think about schools that are fully funded programmatically, have enough students to give your students, to have enough students that have all the programs they need in a school building, I'm not sure the capacity of the building matters too much. A good example, if I could get 750 students, which is kind of a minimum number of middle school kids, but enough to get you a good staffed and programmed school building, but it went into an old high school that had 1,500 seats, would it matter that it's only 50% utilized? Well, maybe not. But if I had 10 that were 50% utilized, then it becomes an issue. And so we don't use utilization as the only factor for decision making because that would be short-sighted in how we use buildings. And so we want to make sure that we're developing this to be a more efficient district. And again, parts of the district don't have any seats. Other districts have too many seats. So how do you even balance that within there? Earlier, I told you about what we call live attend analysis. Now, this is how we look at where students live versus where they attend school. Not really a difficult chart to understand, but I'll make an example. And I'm only going to show you the high school one. I'm not going to go into the middle school one and the elementary one because the elementary one up here will make you blind because it is a lot of data up there. This is in the State of the Schools appendix that you can find. But let me give you an example how this works. Let's look at Douglas High School, which is that white line that goes across right there. If I look across on the Douglas line, you can see it says the total number of APS students that live in that boundary is 1,746 students. Okay, you see that number right there. Now, of those 1,746 students, 1,250 stay in the boundary and attend Douglas High School. 117 leave the boundary, so it's another boundary high school. And then there are 379 that either go to a charter option or a specialty program that leave the boundary to go to that, which tells me there's about almost 30% of students do not stay in that boundary to attend their high school. Now, if I go down the list, for instance, down on Frederick Douglass High School right there, I can see that there are 46 students that actually transfer in. And you can see from which schools they transfer in from. 7 come from Carver, 5 come from Maynard Jackson, 13 come from Washington. Now, once again, what I will tell you is that we don't use this one specific piece of data to make a decision. This can be good indicators for us, though. It can give us information about why students are going to other boundaries, what the reasoning is. Could it be programming? Can we realign programming to reduce this in order to keep kids closer to their neighborhood schools? Well, that's a potential idea. But there's also data in here that may not make a difference because if I go to the elementary school, it might be that a student is the kid of a teacher that just wants to go to the same elementary school that mom or dad works at. So that number's in here too. So I don't necessarily put a judgment on the number. I use it as more of an indicator. Also then, I start to use it in that projection to kind of see, okay, from the live-in projection and the traditional transfer rates across, what does a building really look like in time? So again, that's the elementary one if it gives you any idea, but it's kind of blinding, so I'm not going to leave it up too long. But all the information is there. And when you're online and you're looking at this, you can blow this up and you can see it in bigger numbers. So, or you can print it out if you want. So, facility condition assessment. Again, one of the most important things to realize is, and to see here is that, first of all, the district goes through a pretty inclusive assessment process every 5 years to continuously update data. Now, 5 years is pretty frequent because any good facility data should last, 30 years? Because most systems in a building anything under 30 years gets expired. So flooring, ceilings, lighting. But every 5 years, the district goes through an extensive process to make sure that they have up-to-date condition data because of the E-SPLOST programs that you're in. And so what the thing to know here is, though, is that the total deferred maintenance. Now, what I mean by deferred maintenance is those things that kind of get pushed back beyond maybe their life cycle but there's still good systems out there. The district has a priority of warm, safe, and dry, first of all. So when I say $672 million, it's a big number. But it's not a big number in context to kind of how much facility you own and the total price of the value of your buildings out there. But that number can increase rapidly. If we don't spend the right amount of money on deferred spending or deferred maintenance out there, that number will exponentially grow and get to a point where it's difficult to afford the deferred maintenance out there. And so in a process, you look to figure out strategies of how you maintain a lower or just maintain the number out there. And certainly one is that you can allocate more SPLOST dollars, E-SPLOST dollars, to deferred maintenance. That's one strategy out there. Now, again, many of you know that's like, going to your church congregation, asking them to put a roof or air conditioner in the background that nobody sees, trying to ask money for it, right? Because those are behind the wall things that nobody ever sees, but they're important to the operation of a facility. Or you could replace buildings or put comprehensive renovations into those buildings to help maintain that. Or you could have less portfolio. You can just have less building. Now, that's another strategy towards it. So how do you combine those to get there? Again, ultimately, just a lot of words. What we try to get to is this facility condition index, which is a level of renovation versus replacement. It gives you a number that says it would cost this much to renovate versus replace this building, and that facilities condition index gives you an indicator. What we use is an FCA score, which is kind of the inverse of that, which means the closer to 100 a building has, the better physical condition that building's in. Now, again, just an indicator. It is not the end-all decision maker. And so we use this number to indicate, how good buildings are from a condition standpoint. We pay attention to things like historic standards and paying attention to working with Historic Preservation, Atlantic Preservation Center, and collaborate with that group to make sure that we are looking at that criteria for how we save buildings out there. Now, even in the case where buildings may not be used for schools in the future, we want to make sure that we're not just letting buildings go that have historic value to them. And so working with this group will be very important. Also then, looking at those renovation standards and how we maintain buildings from a health and safety standpoint, from programmatic demands, also from historic and geographic reasoning, and what that means to the preservation of those buildings. So I'm not going to go through these charts, but basically what these charts are is they show you the FCA score on the far right, which tells you, again, closer to 100, the better the condition, but also the repair costs in the building. Now, some of these buildings some of the numbers might look big, and some of them are. I think we had a great question about Carver today. Now, it shows about $13 million. It's recently had some major work into it in the last 2 SPLOST, I guess, but a lot of work into it. But there's still systems out there when you have a building of 315,000 square feet, that $13 million of that, a roof of that size is a lot of money, right? And so there's a lot of kind of those costs that add up to be in that deferred maintenance. Again, all this information is on page 15 and on in the State of the Schools report. Now, finally, framework. This is kind of the crescendo of what we need to talk about. What we talk about in planning is when school districts are trying to face, the amount of programming they want to offer, but want to make sure that they have the right size of schools and have you have to be within an operation cost. This is pretty tricky for schools and for districts. And I think this is exactly what makes districts unique. Because if you look at this and you're trying to look at this triangle, it is very difficult to have all three. To have smaller schools with robust programs at low operating costs. But you try to balance it by saying, if you want low operating costs and robust program offerings, you're going to have little bigger schools in order to do that, because those are funded by how many students walk in those buildings. If you want robust programs with small school sizes, you're going to pay for that. It costs more to have those programs in your building. And then finally, if small schools and low operating costs, you won't have as many robust programs in your buildings that you want. Now, the trick to any good plan, and what makes your plan different than anybody else's, is the shape of this triangle. What are your priorities? Is there a willingness within the budget and within the community to spend dollars to have little smaller schools but diverse programs? And where does that fit? And so over the process of this, we're going to figure out what the shape of this triangle really is. School size plays a critical role in this. At the elementary grade level, we seldom talk about number of students. We really talk about the units of teaching at every grade level. The district does have aspirations to try to get every grade level to at least 4 teachers. And there's reasoning for that. Collaboration, teaming, professional training, certified teachers next to teachers who want certified. All of those things that are difficult to do when there's 1 or 2 teachers per grade level in schools. And so trying to get to that 4 to 6, and if you start to look at what that means for a school in Atlanta Public Schools, that could mean 450 to about 600 students in an elementary school, which is bigger than some schools out there. Now, once again, the message isn't if you're under 450, you're closing. That's not the message at all, because the fact is that 40 of the 49 buildings out there can hold over 500 kids. And so there's plenty of capacity out there in those buildings to handle really programmatically strong elementary schools as we go out there. And so, but if you look at it, 30 of the 49 have less than 500 in it. And so, and I'll show you the impact of that in a minute, but from the middle school standpoint, being 750 to 1,500, even 750, according to the state of Georgia, 750 is still very hard to staff from a funding standpoint. Even though that means it's pretty big for some people in the schools out there, because there are 3 schools that have only 200, there's 240 to 450. A middle school with 240 students in it, trying to be programmatically viable compared to a middle school that has 1,000 kids in it. They look vastly different when it comes to the opportunities for those students out there. Now, at the high schools, the idea is really a balancing of resources and program offering. If you can balance that triangle to make sure there's good programs in those high schools, then obviously the smaller high schools struggle to get those programs in there. We know that. But again, you're not going to have high schools out there that necessarily are going to crest over that 2,500 benchmark, unless you want those, then they could. Depends on those feeders out there. But really it's about balancing those resources and making sure that there's geographic and programmatic continuity of program out there. So if you want to go to a neighborhood school, it has all the programs you need from elementary to middle to high school, or it has the programs you need to have continuity also. And this is what I mean by fully staffing. In the state of Georgia, now this isn't necessarily how schools operate, but in the state of Georgia, that minimum staffing of schools under 450, this is what the state would actually fund. Now, your schools, you have these services in the buildings, and it's all locally funded. And so that puts, and I will tell you, when you start to have budget crisis, and when you start to look at the budgets and the income coming into school districts, when it comes to all the raising costs of what this district wants to be doing, this is tough to do, because and at the middle school, if you look under 600, look at that. You get 1 AP. Even at the elementary school, the state doesn't fund an AP under 450. You have schools that have APs that are under 450 out there. And so that's all locally funded. You bring that in yourself and you pay for that yourself. So at the high school, again, under that 1,000 enrollment, that's what you get. But watch what happens when I start to get at that 450 number, and I start to get at the middle school number of 700 plus, and then at the high school over 1,500. That is a huge difference in funding how schools staff across the district. And so again, if I just kind of benchmark it by doing this, you can see all of those opportunities that we have for maximizing the state dollars that come in and taking pressure off of that budget cycle out there, that reinvest in students where necessary. So these are the things we talk about in programmatic framework. We talk about early childhood an awful lot because that's kind of they'll have a big impact on facilities. You want to grow, this district has a commitment to universal pre-K. And the earlier we can get kids, the better. We know that. And so we know research says that. The career and technical and agriculture education, CTAE, really critical component. Again, how this district moves forward. Again, not necessarily the old school thinking of career and technical education, but how this pushes us forward. Multilingual programs, again, it's celebrating the rich diversity of this district and the continued growth of diversity in this district from different backgrounds. Signature programs out there, the fine arts and athletics should play a role in that. You know, that full liberal arts education is really, really important to APS. So again, I'm not going to have you read these charts, but what the state of the school shows you is where programs are located. You know, these are for exceptional student education, for special education courses out there, that where they're located and how they're located. These have a huge impact on the district. What I find fascinating about the CTAE program is just all the great things that are happening that kind of maybe not be projected out there. Look at that. 50 of the APS valedictorians over the last 5 years, salutatorians and star students, came out of the CTAE program. I'm telling you, this is where things are happening. And there's growth and there's change. And there has to be adaptation to where those programs are located and how you can grow those programs in a program just like this. But you need the right facilities to do it. And so it has to be integrated into this. And so, and then pushing down to middle school, more and more important, push down the middle school, because that's the exploratory years. I was an old middle school teacher. I did middle school, and it's really about exploration. You know, you don't think about that. You think middle school is something a lot different, but it's really about exploring your future. If we can expand those CTAE programs, but you have to have the enrollment to do it in those buildings. Again, just some information about where these programs are located. And again, you can find these in your State of the Schools report. Charter schools play a role in this district, and we know they do. As you look out there, and why they matter is that they can create some opportunities where opportunities don't exist if they're performing, and that's a big thing. One of the big things we have to pay attention to is that there are, you can see the asterisk schools out there are charters that are on probationary status that could have an impact of up to 3,500 students that could return back into an APS building. Now, the thing is we don't know that until 2027. And so we have to have some fluidity and flexibility in this plan that if that does happen, what or how do we react to that? All right? And so, but also keep in mind, we're very clear on this. It's not the facilities plan that determines what happens to these buildings. It's their probationary status that determines what happens to these buildings, to those students. And so, but as we look at it, again, including that information into our planning process. The operational framework talks about right sizing and making sure that we have enough facilities and spaces within those facilities to handle the students that we have coming. Thresholds for that, the increases and decreases that we pay attention to, those thresholds of capacity, enrollment trends that we see, physical education opportunity, or the physical and educational opportunities in those buildings. Geography can matter a lot when it comes to planning. Even what we might think of a more condensed area like an urban area, schools that are located in inadequate and inappropriate locations increase travel time, take away walkability. So we got to pay attention to those things in here. And then looking at district-wide utilization, those programmatic impacts, when we make decision, what's the programmatic impact? Not just the facilities impact, but how we impacting those programs that are in those buildings. The operational framework comes to balancing those declining enrollment. How do you do that? Do you use boundary adjustments? Do you use feeder adjustments? But I will tell you, sometimes those are meaningless. You can move a boundary and nobody will care. They'll just transfer back to the old building. And so do they make a difference when you do that? And how much impact can that really do? Oftentimes it's more about feeder and programmatic feeder about how you can get students to feed in the building better. And so really paying attention to what we mean when we talk about rezoning. I know there's communities out there that are worried that this plan is going to rezone them somewhere. But again, we really have to understand the impact of rezoning in a district like this and what it means from a geographic and a programmatic standpoint as you go through this. Looking at that condition level and what standards do we set to make sure that our deferred maintenance doesn't go too far, and how we keep buildings at minimum warm, safe, and dry, but even better, programmatically viable for their students. And then setting some renovation and replacement standards to say, at some point buildings do need replaced, and it's okay to replace some buildings out there. And sometimes it's okay to build a building where it ain't because students are there now. And so thinking about that as we inform this East Blast over the next several cycles of East Blast will be really important in this renovation versus replacement standard. So that brings us to the end, the questionnaire. So the questionnaire, you can see on here, there's a QR code that you can go to, or there's the link in it. There is a Spanish version of this also, so you know there's a Spanish version of this presentation also online. But these questions address things like prioritizing the plan. One of the key questions is, what are your priorities when it comes to a facilities plan like this? And what's important to you? And this will differ by different clusters. And so paying attention to that as we look across the district. This school size and the program delivery, that matters. How much, where do you want those schools to be? It asks questions around early childhood, fine arts. We just blatantly ask the question, do you think there needs to be a performing arts center in this district? And should we move in that direction with the rich history of arts and music and entertainment and the growing entertainment industry in this city? Do we adapt to that? The multilingual services, again, as this diversity grows and cultures from all over the world continue to come to Atlanta and grow. How do our facilities accommodate that? And is there access out there? We ask a couple questions on career and technical. We also ask some boundary and feeder questions. And we're just going to blatantly ask you, kind of where your tolerance is for that. And then finally, those strategies for renovation versus replacement, future facilities. It's not just a simple thing, the plan building. You can see in that kind of what I call my Matchbox car presentation, that old guy on the commercial that talked rapidly to get through all the data so it doesn't seem so long. But it is comprehensive and it's oftentimes complicated. And trying to understand that community voice along with the data and trying to merge the two isn't always easy. Consensus sometimes is, I kind of think that I've done this long enough to know whatever consensus means to you, it means different to everybody. I'm not even sure consensus exists out there when it comes to something this massive. I use that example all the time. I got 4 people in my household. We can't come to consensus on dinner most, right? And so trying to come to a consensus around the city sometimes isn't always an easy thing. And there's hard decisions that are going to have to be made. Even new and renovations are hard decisions to make because they displace students, they move boundaries, they shift feeder patterns. So even the newness of facilities can cause complications. But what I want to make sure is that we work together and get as much feedback as we can to do this. And sometimes you're not going to like the answer, but sometimes you're going to really like the answer in the plan. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. And again, I appreciate the grace and patience that you give me when I do this, when I do this piece, because I really do want to try to get as much information out there as I can. So George, I'll turn it back.
And you know what, Tracy, why don't we leave that slide up just in case anybody wants to take a picture of that link and share it and post it on social media, because I can't stress this enough. This survey will be active until June 15th. June 15th, this survey will be active, and this will really play a huge role in forming the decision and the proposal that's presented to the Board of Education. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of this. Before I introduce who will be moderating this portion for us, I just wanted to point out, if anybody would like to speak, we have some public comment cards there. And just for the consistency of integrity and transparency, I know we have a small group, but I'll still ask you to please fill that out so we can have it for the record. Also, this next person that will be leading us through this portion should be a familiar face or voice. Her name is Jocelyn Dorsey. She is a retired journalist from WSB. She started a lot of community-focused programming at WSB and also was very, very active in APS when she had both of her children attend the school system. So with that being said, let me welcome Jocelyn Dorsey so she can share a little bit more about her. And then if you want to start with the questions, just meet me up there. Come on up, Jocelyn.
We're on. Good evening. No, we gotta act like they're the first.
I already tried that, Jocelyn. They're scared of each other. I don't know what it is. But if you can, let's fill in these seats. That'll really help us in a way to make this a conversation. And even if you are with the school system, but particularly if you're a parent, please come up closer. We really want to make this an engaging conversation. Go ahead, Jocelyn.
Wow. Were you overwhelmed? I mean, I was kind of overwhelmed, and not only overwhelmed, but thrilled to see that there's going to be such deliberateness that's going to be taken into the long-range plan. And I think people need to realize that it is a long-range plan. I'll introduce myself briefly. I am Jocelyn Dorsey, and I was the community and editorial affairs director for WSV from 1983 until present. And I started out, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I came to Atlanta in 1973. I'm not going to go through all 45 years, but I came to Atlanta in 1973, and it was a pivotal period that I found out in Atlanta. And when I had my children, when I came to Atlanta, let me go back to 1973, I was a reporter and became the first Black African American anchor at WSB. Well, actually, in Atlanta. And so it was a very interesting period during that time. To give you some context, and people were like, oh, you've got to be kidding. They were still burning crosses on the top of Stone Mountain, which was owned by the Grand Wizard of the KKK. So you can see Atlanta has come a long way from there. And so when I first started in journalism, we had what newspapers had, which were like beats or areas of expertise. And so I chose, because my mother was an educator of 40-some years. She was a teacher and taught many different grades. And I chose to be the education reporter for WSB for 10 years. So I covered the Atlanta Board of Education when Dr. Mays was the board chair, and became very close to him and learned a lot about public education. I'm a product of public education in Cincinnati. My children were part of the minority majority program, which was in effect the desegregation of Atlanta Public School, which I didn't realize that's what that was. So it was a very interesting time, and I learned a lot about the culture and the nature of the Atlanta public school system. Being asked to do this forum, however, has been a great eye-opener, again, because I looked at the board structure of the Atlanta public schools and, oh, wow, I was thrilled to see the level of expertise in the Atlanta Board of Education that, quite frankly, did not exist in the 70s. And I won't go into that, but to see the level of expertise, the level of education, and obviously now the level of thought that the Atlanta Board of Education has put into this, I mean, to see all of this is just amazing. So I want you to think of the fact, and then you go, okay, we've got all this data, we've got all this information. Where do I fit in as a community person? What occurred to me, and I worked with some nonprofit organizations that dealt with education all over the state, and the light bulb for me went off when I was working with a school system, and it wasn't the Atlanta Public Schools, but I was working with a school system and understood how school systems and schools think outside of the box. And so I encourage you, when I give you this example, to go, aha, there's some other things that I can think outside of the box in terms of programmatic things. There was a problem at one of the schools. It was a high school in the metro Atlanta area. And one of the things that they were doing was renovating an area for a laundromat. And I thought, why would they have a laundromat in the school? And I found out, much to my dismay, that that particular school had a large population of students who were homeless. And they discovered that because the kids were coming to school and they had an odor. And so the teachers were very aware, very sensitive to this, and discovered that the reason that they had an odor was because most of these kids were living in the extended stay hotels, that they call them, and they weren't able to wash their clothes when they came to school. And in fact, the conditions that they were living in were really homeless. And so I thought, oh my goodness. And this school ended up building a laundromat in the school so the kids could come and wash their clothes, dry their clothes, and, be at least presentable to other students who were complaining about these kids in the class. So I use that as an example. When you talk about utilization of a building, it's not just the utilization of the air conditioning and all of that, even the classrooms, but to think outside the box, because, the demographics of a student population could be very different from what you're thinking that demographic is. So with that, I ask you to think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in advance to see what do you envision those schools to look like. I can think immediately when you think of how do the old buildings adapt to the new technology. When you think of all the electricity, even the plugs back then that, I can think that the facilities person will probably tell you that there was coding that said that, a plug had to be in every 10 feet, and then it would only had so many outlets. But now when you try to charge phones and everything like that, you probably need 20 plugs in an area where before you maybe use 10. So those are the types of things that we want you to begin to think about. This is not a session where you come and talk about, what it is you want in your classroom tomorrow. That's not what this is. It's more of a grand global 30,000-foot view of what you want Atlanta Public Schools to look like in the future. So have I set that tone?
That was great. And, I think that I have identified at least a parent area. If I'm in the wrong area, let me know. But here's what I'm going to do. We got a smaller group. I'm just going to come to you. Even if you don't have a question, we'd love to just hear your name, what school your child attends, and what brought you here. And if you do have a question, please let us know. I'll start with you if that's okay.
And it's Laura Hawk. My child attends Douglas High School. And I do actually have some questions. Yes, so I still want the cart. You want you to? In the presentation, I obviously saw facilities mentioned, but you spoke about historic preservation, and we have facilities that are not currently in use within APS. So is that a part of this consideration? And how does that factor into your plan? And then also considering if there is a shift in anything, whether it's feeder schools, whether it is boundaries, whatever, that's going to shift traffic, right? So where also are we having conversations? Is that a part of any of this discussion in regards to, I guess, the facilities plan? I recognize that you can't speak to ADOT plans, but is that something, will you be identifying what this is and conveying this to whomever the powers that be?
So let me start with kind of the disposition of buildings that don't get used to. The last thing a facilities plan should create is blight. Last thing. And there are beautiful buildings in this district that currently have to figure out some reuse to them, right? That have been displaced even in the last several years by when charters come in or whatever it is. And so every building that is not going to be used or used for some purpose has to be identified as you go through a plan like this. And it could be that and one of the big things is one thing we ask the task force is about opportunities in their cluster. And those opportunities could be, maybe more access to 4F daycare, or it could be, look, there's needs for teacher housing out there. There are needs for those kind of things that we need to start thinking about how we keep attracting good teachers into the. So there's plenty of reuse. And then again, working with the city to figure out, do we work at Parks and Rec to see are there needs that the Parks and Rec have? All those things. So that's number one. We will identify that. The second one is paying attention to traffic patterns is very important. So walkability for us is really critical, especially, and it is, and we know that. But there are students that are closer to buildings today than the building they attempt. And so even moving students could be a better walkability solution for them. Now, the traffic, we will we have the ability, we use a system called Geographic Information Systems that kind of links into transportation systems too. And so one of the critical one of the critical departments that works in scenario and options development and recommendation development is transportation. They have to be at the table. And so we're going to pay attention to that. When something happens, and whether it's a move in or move out or a shift over, one of the things we have to pay attention to is that very factor. We don't do it up front, and the reason we don't do it up front is because there'd be a billion different kind of combinations. We'd spend all of our time thinking about how a kid walks to school versus, what the bigger picture is for where schools do in your region. Great question, Tom.
And then the question is, what would be your idea, knowing that you're in that location and you know the existence of such a facility? How would you like to see it used in the future? So, I mean, we want that type of community input, not just directing, having him direct the plan for you. It's as you are a parent and a student and looking at the future, how would you want to see that?
And then piggybacking on that, on the noon virtual, we had about 160 participants. And I said, this is great. Today by 6 o'clock, we should have 160 responses on the survey, plus, maybe another 160 because you shared it with someone. So I'll challenge you all to add to that 160. Maybe we'll have 165 tonight. Before we go to the next person, I did want to share this with you all. Even if you don't want it, even if you already have it, just take it out of my hand. And just
I literally already put it on my computer.
good to make sure that I give it to every parent that is in here, anybody that isn't with the school system. The main reason is this is how we will push the boundaries of exposure. When you go to church, make sure you share with folks that you were here. When you go to work, if you have a parent, coworkers who have students that attend APS, please, please, please save those days, pass them around and put them on your social media. The more people we reach, the greater a chance of us getting closer to that consensus that Tracy was talking about, that sometimes is hard to put all together. Sir, can I come to you?
Sorry. Hey, hello, mate. We're practicing, sure. That's all fine and well. Good evening. And my name is Barry Love. I'm actually a parent, but not a parent, a child in APS. I'm just more so a concerned citizen in the Metro Atlanta community and always looking for Atlanta Public Schools to rise. I'm an entrepreneur in the town, and it means a lot to have a solid, stable school system here. So just as an engaged entrepreneur in the region, or is it? Perfect. Love that. Thanks for being.
But you're part of the community.
I am part of the community.
And I'm sure you have ideas.
Hey, no, it's I'm going to be sure.
Please give us feedback.
Yeah, honey.
Because that's all part of the community. And, in fact, there's projects that are going on currently. A lot of people may not know in the Atlanta Public Schools that are using schoolyards or transforming schoolyards into community parks. And I've watched, in fact, worked with the facilities management on a of the parks, the community parks that would be used by the community that are actually schoolyards. So there's all sorts of different things where the community is integrating with the school, is not apart from the school. I get it. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, Mike Sierra Cowell. I am a parent, but also work here in the district.
I'm not a parent in Raggy School District as well. I'm always fascinated by the data around students who live in one area that attend school in the other. And I was wondering if there's any utility to doing like exit interviews where students and families who were opting to choose something different. 10 years old school, so we could put theater hacker to who's going where and why. That could help inform some of our strategies in decision making.
And I think student surveys and family surveys were very effective in this. Because you're right. When I look at the data, again, what's really important, I don't really place judgment on the data because it's hard to. I mean, people make decisions for good reasons and for the betterment of their educational experience. But it would be nice to know if it's because I have to go chase a program. It would be nice to know is that I don't have an exceptional student classroom I can go to that serves the needs of my child. It'd be nice to know those kind of things to kind of better, again, with using the information that we have, this is one good tool, and using the GIS information that we have, we've been able to work in districts to say, you have you have all these students going to this program here, but there's such a condensed area of students who can get it here. Why wouldn't we think about how we improve our facilities to get the program where we need to get to? I think so. We should probably explore how we can get that data better. And I'm sure there's probably some data out there about transfer applications, why people might put it. So we'll do a deeper dive in this. I think that's a great thing to kind of look for.
And it's funny you say that because when I was enrolling my kids in the Atlanta Public School, the reason that I chose the school was because it was closest to my office. So there are, different reasons. It's not always programmatic. It could be geographic. And, so I'm glad you raised that because that is an important issue. And it is
And I don't want to ignore that sometimes what's hidden underneath that data that we don't really, that it's hard to get a grasp on. One of the biggest impacts of student performance in this district is transients. And how do you kind of get your arms around that, right? How do how can a facilities plan, now they can't solve everything. Now, and sometimes I think I get a little maybe poetic in what this can't do, but what I know it can just solve everything. But how can a facilities plan help support more stabilization? Because I do think that, poverty and transients have more impact on the daily performance of the student than almost everything in school performance. And that's just the fact. And so how can we stabilize that? Can we create where buildings aren't being used, or we create centers where at least they can go to a center area to get services? Can we put schools in locations where it might reduce some transients? Are there possibilities around that? We need to explore that. Look, at some point it becomes more personal than just build a plan. That you've got to hit every kid. And even the ones that don't have a voice, that will never show up to these meetings, that will never answer a survey. They are important to this. So how do we get our arms around it? That are kind of hidden underneath those numbers that we can't see. So keep bringing that one up, I think.
Feel free to raise your hand here if you think of something that you want to talk about. And we're mobile.
Yeah, I would just want to say, I won't put you on the spot, but just for show of hands, can you raise your hand if you're a parent with a student in APS or just engaged in the APS school system because of this community?
It's a parent.
There's one, there's a couple. Okay, great. Do you have a question, sir? Just no question?
I don't have a question. I was on the 12 o'clock.
No, but who are you? But that's wait.
I was too. So what is it? Pretty.
Yeah, so I don't really have a question. I'm here really more to gather information before I start asking a bunch of questions. I don't want to roll to judgment, but I have a recent graduate of the APS school from the Carver Cluster, and I had two children that are coming up through that currently attend Perkison Elementary. So I'm just here to gather information. There was a lot of we at the Perkison in the Carver Cluster. The information was not trickling down as we wanted it to. So I just took it upon myself to make sure that I came to the meetings to gather that information to help disseminate it to my fellow parents and the staff of in my community. I'm a recent home owner in that area. There's as you may know, that area is kind of booming in terms of real estate, and I want to make sure that there's some sort of correlation and improvement in the schools in my area as well. Me and my wife, we definitely believe in public schools. So, we're sending the most valuable things that we have in our family to these schools. So we're making a real investment. And both me and my wife are, college educated and want to make sure that we can bring our family values as well as our understanding to the community and, use that as much as possible so that we can leverage it. So that's...
Man, I'm glad we changed you the mic. That was the whole purpose of these meetings. I'm not going to lie. It's not just a question. It could also be a comment, or it could just be some information gathering to pass along. So please, if you're streaming this right now, if you're watching it on the YouTube, please take this gentleman's comment as an example, and thank you for sharing that. That is very valuable, and I loved how you said that the most valuable thing that you send to the school every day is your children, and that's the real investment that you're making. And I know that the students, I know teachers and the leadership here at APS recognize that. I'm going to just give this with you. Please share that. And I wanted to reiterate something about this flyer. Just like Tracy said, and as you heard in the video, it'd be at least 4 meetings. We have put the 4 identified meetings on here as of right now. But again, as we move through this process, we'll learn more. And there'll be more discussions and more comments and maybe areas or clusters specific that we need to go to address. So I just wanted you to know these are hard days, but they're just the bare minimum. Likely there will be more.
George, can I interrupt the general here? Because one of the points of your comment about getting the information, Carver's not hearing the information about this to get it out there. It's really important that we get that feedback, that if people in Carver didn't hear about this, we need to make sure people in Carver hear about this, right? And so that kind of feedback for us, so as we walk through this survey, one of the primary reasons we asked the demographic question isn't to kind of single people out. It's really to identify where we're missing. So as we walk through the next several weeks of the survey, we track it. We're like, hey, we're not getting any sort of representation from this. What do we have to do? What principals do we have to call? What go teams do we have to call? What do we have to do to make sure we get as much participation in this? Even in our task force meetings, the ones that we've invited every school to be there, and we've offered a makeup meeting for those people who represent schools that couldn't be there. We're trying to do our best. So when you give us feedback like that, that's the reason we're tracking like we do, because we want to make sure that everybody's at least the best we can. We can't go knock on doors, but we could certainly do better.
And understand that each school has a representative. So what you may do is go back to your school administrators and ask who the representative is and how that information is being disseminated, because all the schools have been asked to have a representative on the committee.
I'll correct you, your man, in 1 second. One thing I did want to point out too is that on that landing page, you'll be able to find everything that we've talked about, whether it's been these presentations, whether it's been the survey, whether it's the state of the schools, whether it is the upcoming meetings, whether it's any of the videos. We've tried to put that on that landing page. And the other thing that I will share with you is that, yes, this is a living document. So, this team will leave here and they'll edit this. So if it's not on there right within 24 hours, just know that within 48, if not less, all of this information will be posted. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate the information that there is a representative from each school, because I also did not hear about this on the school level. I just get the APS district emails. So do you have a list of all the representatives? Because like this gentleman, I attended the noon meeting, and once I saw the dates, I sent them to 6 friends in different schools. So I've done my part, but I would love to have the names of these representatives to also pass on to those friends, so that then they could reach out to their representatives and make sure. One other thing I would suggest, and this is just a personal pet peeve, I appreciate the APS always gives us dates in advance. I put them on the calendar. If you would do us the kindness of creating either Eventbrite or something like that, where we can feed it into our digital calendars, that actually makes it very easy. Anything that lets me fit it into Google Calendar makes it a lot easier in my life.
Again, another perfect example of these meetings, then that you will be seeing the Eventbrites, and we'll even do Facebook events, anything that we can to push the boundaries of exposure. And regarding your original question about the committee and how to find them and who they are, yes, on that landing page, and I'll see if we can get online here in a second. We just work it out so you could see it. But on that landing page, if you go, you'll see it has a committee task force. And where the 3 heads are at, the 3 little outlines of the body, if you click that hyperlink, it will take you automatically to the list for all of the committee, and it'll show you all that.
And that would be, it was funny, I was just going to say that tell us how parents are being communicated at Carver, for example. you know, how do they get the word? Do they get it on their website? You know, I know one of the schools that my grandson was working with had a very robust website where they could go to the website and find out everything. So give us, you know, many of us aren't aware of how people are communicating with. I mean, I'm old, so it's a, you know, I know TikTok and, you know, all these other things that people communicate with, but a lot of assumptions may be made on traditional forms of communication. So, you know, give us the suggestions on how to do that better, because this is not an exercise that we want to do in a vacuum. This is something that we want to do with the community. More questions?
Now, is there another question? No. Now, I will add this. As a former journalist myself, and Jocelyn can also relate to this, we know that reporters are on deadlines. So CBS, Landon News First is here, so I want to make sure we give her enough time to edit her story, everything. So we'll close for right now this portion, but here's what I mean. We're not going to leave. We'll stick around. Jocelyn, Tracy, myself, members of APS will stick around to answer any questions, any comments that you have. Because of everything going on, I figured this may be an appropriate time to at least close this portion of it, the official portion, but we'll still be here. And thank you all so much. Jocelyn, thank you so much. Tracy, do you have any closing comments, anything you want to reiterate?
I think they probably heard my voice.
Folks, thank you so much. And like I said, we'll stick around. Please come introduce yourselves and give us any contact information. Thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Spread the word.
Yes.
Sounds like